Ever wondered why some relationships just expire?
Like that carton of milk in the back of your fridge, you forget about it and then...
Exactly. And then you're left wondering where it all went wrong. Well, listeners asked us to deep dive into why relationships end, romantic relationships specifically. And we found this heart-to-heart episode that really breaks it down.
And it's not just the usual cliches, like, he's just not that into you or whatever. They actually get into the nitty-gritty of what makes relationships tick. Or in this case, tick away until they just stop.
Right, exactly. They start with what they call the usual suspects, like communication breakdowns, which, let's be honest, we've all been there.
Oh, for sure. But they make a really good point that it's not just about, like, the quantity of communication. It's more about the quality.
Yeah, you can talk all day long, but if you're not really hearing each other, or if you're holding back, not saying what you really mean.
It's like that's when the resentment starts to build, right? Those unspoken words, they turn into these little wedges.
Little wedges that become big walls. And then there's the whole intimacy thing. And we're not just talking about sex here.
Right, although that's definitely part of it. They call it an intimacy fade out, which I thought was kind of a funny way to put it. But
Right.
it's so true.
Like, you can be with someone for years, even share the same bed every night, but emotionally, you're miles apart.
And that can be so lonely and confusing too, because on paper, everything looks fine.
You're a unit, you do things together, but that spark, that real connection, it's just gone. Then, of course, there's always the classic life gets in the way scenario.
Ugh, tell me about it. Careers, kids, the mortgage.
Yeah.
It's like all this stuff piles up and suddenly you're living parallel lives instead of intertwined ones.
And the episode actually does a great job of explaining how this can happen even when you start out with shared goals and dreams.
Yeah,
Like you both want to travel the world, but then one of you gets offered that amazing job that ties you down.
exactly. Or you both want kids, but then the timing never seems to work out. And those differences in priorities, they can create these huge rifts.
And sometimes those rifts are just too big to bridge.
Definitely. Okay, but we can't talk about relationships ending without talking about trust. Because if
Yeah.
that's broken, forget it. It's over.
Game over, right.
Yeah.
And it's not always some big dramatic betrayal like infidelity,
Right. Although that's certainly up there on the list of trust breakers.
for sure. But what I thought was interesting was how the episode highlighted how even those little white lies, those seemingly insignificant breaches of trust, can really add up over time.
It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Each
Really?
one on its own, not a big deal. But all together,
They erode the foundation of the relationship, and then before you know it, you're questioning everything.
which can be so damaging. And then, kind of on a similar note, they talk about the danger of unresolved conflict.
Because, let's face it, every couple argues. It's normal, it's healthy even.
Right, disagreeing is human. But if you're constantly sweeping things under the rug, pretending everything's fine when it's really not.
That's when those little resentments we were talking about earlier start to fester and grow.
Exactly. It's like that saying, don't go to bed angry. There's definitely some truth to that.
Absolutely. Now, to really dig deeper into all of this, they actually have a relationship psychologist on the episode, Dr. Expert Name, who drops some serious knowledge.
Okay, so Dr. Expert Name had me nodding along so hard my head almost fell off.
Tell me about it. Their main point was that so many relationships fail simply because couples stop putting in the effort. Like, they treat the relationship like a houseplant they watered once and expect it to just thrive on its own.
And it just doesn't work that way. Relationships require attention, care, and consistent effort.
It's like anything else you value in life, right? You don't buy a new car and then never take it for an oil change. You don't just, like, hope for the best.
And yet, for some reason, we often expect our relationships to just magically maintain themselves.
Maybe because we see all these fairy tales where it's just effortless, happily ever after.
Right, like love conquers all.
Yeah.
But in reality, it's not always that simple.
Nope, definitely not. So anyway, after Dr. Expert Name totally blew our minds, the episode shifts gears a bit and shares some real-life stories from listeners who've experienced breakups firsthand.
And I have to say, these stories were so relatable. Like, I'm sure everyone listening could relate to at least one of them.
Oh, absolutely. The first story was about this woman who ended a relationship because she realized she and her partner were on totally different paths, and it broke her heart. But ultimately, she knew it was the right decision.
And what I loved about her story was her honesty. She admitted that it would have been easier to just stay together, to avoid the pain of a breakup, but she knew that in the long run, it would have been more painful to stay in a relationship that wasn't fulfilling for either of them.
So true. And then the second story, oh my gosh, this one was a classic example of how those small, everyday annoyances, if you don't address them, can turn into these huge relationship-ending blowouts.
Seriously, it was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. You could just see how their communication had completely broken down.
And by the end, they were so focused on being right, on winning the argument, that they completely lost sight of each other.
Which is like the opposite of what a relationship should be.
Exactly. But what I appreciated about the episode was that it didn't end on a depressing note, like, oh, relationships are doomed, everyone's going to break up eventually. Instead, they actually framed breakups as opportunities for growth.
Right, like a stepping stone, not a failure.
Exactly. And one of the tips they gave for turning a breakup into something positive was to do what they called a relationship post-mortem.
Ooh, that sounds intense. Like, are we dissecting a frog or a relationship?
I know, right? But it's actually not as morbid as it sounds. It's really just about taking some time to reflect on what worked in the relationship, what didn't, what you learned from the experience.
So you can make better choices next time. I like it.
Me too. And of course, they also emphasize the importance of self-care after a breakup, like giving yourself permission to grieve, but also making sure you're doing things you enjoy, spending time with loved ones, all that good stuff.
Yes, because self-care isn't selfish, especially after a breakup. It's essential.
Absolutely. And finally, they made a really interesting point about using the experience to establish healthier boundaries and expectations in future relationships.
Because you know what you don't want. It's like weeding out the duds before you even start dating them.
Exactly. It's all about learning and growing. So while this episode focused specifically on romantic relationships, it got me thinking, how much of this applies to other types of relationships in our lives?
Ooh, that's a great question. Like, do friendships, family relationships, even work relationships crumble for the same reason?
Yeah. Is it all kind of the same at the core? Something to ponder for sure.
Definitely. Food for thought, listeners. Food for thought.